Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Russian President Vladimir Putin heads for a landslide win after getting more than 3/4 of the vote. Mr. Putin warns of tough times ahead, though. Will his fresh mandate enable him to fix Russia's economy? And Dante Lam helmed the war blockbuster Operation Red Sea, no small feat for a filmmaker. Dante tells us in a sit-down interview the kind of effort it took to shoot a Navy film done on a grand scale. You're watching World Insight. Vladimir Putin has sealed his victory in Russia's presidential election. With more than 56 million votes, it was Mr. Putin's biggest win and the largest by any post-Soviet Russian leader. The victory will take Putin's dominance of the nation's politics to nearly a quarter of a century, until the year 2024 at least.
Smiles and cheers on the faces of young volunteers at Putin's election campaign headquarters. But the atmosphere wasn't ecstatic at all, most likely because everybody, not just his supporters, expected him to win. And when the Russian president appeared here, he didn't fuel the euphoric fire. Instead, he warned of tough times ahead and emphasized the need for unity regardless of political affiliation. In the next 6 years, he expects a lot of support from his election team too.
I would like our team to be preserved for the next few years, so we can work effectively for the benefit of Russia and in the name of Russia. Thank you very much.
Mr. Putin was re-elected amid unprecedented challenges, given that Russia has been facing rigorous sanctions from Western countries such as the US, Britain, Germany, and France. China's President Xi Jinping has congratulated President Putin on his re-election. Speaking by phone, President Xi said China's ties with Russia are better than ever before, setting an example for building a new type of international relations featuring mutual respect, fairness and justice, cooperation, and win-win results. The expanding cooperation between China and Russia in recent years, including their joint efforts to build large-scale oil and gas cooperation, are meant to develop the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, their BRICS membership, and to pursue China's Belt and Road Initiative with the Eurasian Economic Union. They have improved bilateral ties while facilitating their economic development, contributing to regional and global peace and stability, and bringing tangible benefits to both countries.
So what is the takeaway of the Russian election? Let's turn to our panel. With us here in the Beijing studio, Dmitry Trenin, who is the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you again.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And Alexander Gabriev, a senior fellow and the chair of Russia in the Asia-Pacific program of the Carnegie Moscow Center. Welcome as well.
Pleasure, Tian Wei. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Okay. What is the takeaway from this election? Your response first.
Well, it was an important election in the sense that Mr. Putin's victory in the election was a very solid one.
About
68%. The most important thing is the turnout, not so much the vote for Putin, but the turnout. The turnout was just shy of 70, which was about the objective of the Kremlin. And the vote for Putin was almost 77% of the vote, which means that for the first time in Russian history, the president was elected with the majority of all voters, both voting and abstaining from the vote.
What does it tell us?
It tells you that there is a significant degree of mobilization of the Russian people and the effect of rallying around the flag in the situation of confrontation with the United States has worked to the satisfaction of the Kremlin.
So economy does not matter that much.
Economy indeed doesn't matter that much, though the last 3 years, for the first time under very long Putin's rule, have been pretty tough for the Russian population, and the real disposable income have gone down. But the Russian people were persuaded, or they chose voluntarily, depends on which side of the debate you come from, that to support the leader at times where a foreign power tries to squeeze us hard and to push us into the corner, that you need to be united around the leader. And the Kremlin fully utilized that. And I think that the sanctions had an impact of actually boosting the popularity of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin regime.
But at the same time, many of the intellectuals, whichever camp they're coming from, are asking about the specific plans for the economic development. Do you think President Putin, as a candidate, and now, once again, into the office, can provide and has provided some of the concrete steps that could eventually, according to you, lead to some results?
Well, Mr. Putin, as president, delivered the State of the Nation address just 17 days before the vote. And it had two parts. The first part talked about his domestic plans, and they were aplenty. And the second part talked about his weapons, new weapons, they were also aplenty. I would say that most people are not spending too much time and not asking too many questions about future economic plans. For most people, the big thing is that things do not get worse than they are today, that somehow we scrape through, that somehow we manage, muddle through, whatever.
Yeah.
The issue is that, in my view, Mr. Putin is about two things as Russia's foremost leader. One is keeping the country in one piece. And two...
So-called united.
Yes. And two, restoring Russia's status worldwide as a great power. Now, President Putin clearly understands the importance of this vote and the mandate, the strong mandate that he has received.
Right.
His focus will not be the economy, although some things will be done on the economic field.
Arguably, what is the meaning of status?
In the pragmatic school of thought, say that a country really gains respect because of its relative economic weight. Russia doesn't do that. We are a commodity-based economy for a variety of reasons, including vested interests around that which prevent us from launching a meaningful structural reform. So Russia is a dwarf in economic terms, though it's pretty sizable. But we definitely have new instruments, including a military tool, which we use to restore our status in international affairs. And it's more about to be perceived as a great power by others and be respected across the board for the tools that you have. So it's punching above the weight economically, but it also can use these military tools, what very few can do, and also have political will to push against the United States.
I'm not sure if that is really the answer. Even from outside Russia, I question about that, because think about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Russia was in pieces. Well, at the same time, its economy suffered greatly. And as a result, people like President Putin rose in the Russian political scene in a way believed by people to save the country. So I'm not sure whether economy did not matter at all in the Russian politics.
It did, and Putin was very fortunate.
You are saying not anymore?
I think that Putin miraculously managed, and that's his brilliance as a tactician and political operator, to persuade Russians that the benchmark to which you compare your current state of consumption livelihood is 1992, 1993, when the economy was in tatters after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And as long as you don't go there, so if Putin is out of the picture, you immediately go to the beginning of the 90s. And there is a long, long way to go there. So as far as you maintain stability, you can keep up with economic hardships, given that you have this newly discovered pride.
It seems that President Putin, to a certain extent, Mr. Chen, has caught this mentality of the Russian people, that is, they don't want chaos. They don't want to go back to what the early 1990s was like for them, in which they suffer economically, while at the same time they suffer from a scattered around the country, and of course loss of international status. Is that your feeling?
Well, I wonder who prefers chaos. I don't think that there are many people who would prefer chaos over some kind of order. Well, of course, it makes a difference what kind of order you establish in place of chaos. Mm-hmm. But I think that this achievement by President Putin, which dates back to the early 2000s, is something that he has already been credited with. It's his 4th presidential term.
Yes.
He has had 3 elections before that. So I don't think you can ride on that much longer. I don't think that this election was about Putin saving the Russian people from the chaos of the 1990s. It was about Putin, the commander-in-chief, standing up tall against the pressure of the United States and championing Russian interests around Russia and around the world.
You said it wouldn't be long, and yet you've seen that in the previous elections also of President Putin, that he's trying to rally the country and make it successfully. So you're saying it's not be long, but it's being repeated once and again.
No, what I meant that in electoral terms, you cannot refer the electorate to something that to the dragons that you slayed 18 years ago, 16 years ago. Some people would not remember that. So he has to be something else to the people who are voting today. Of course, that's his achievement. That's part of his record. But there's something else to his record, and that something else is his ability to stand tall, be Russia's champion around the world. And that's what counts today.
Gentlemen, interesting. Our conversation has reached to this stage. It cannot reach to a semi-conclusion even, in a way, that the election is not about how Russia is. It's the election about Russia versus, let's just say, the United States. It's a vote about how far the United States has been left behind rather than how advanced Russia is today. Is that what you're trying to say and trying to persuade me?
No. Well, what I'm trying to say is that basically you have a country which finds itself in a position of someone pressured from the outside in a fairly big way. And in that situation, this is not war that we traditionally think of wars, but this is something closest to it.
Why we hear the word war repeatedly so often these days? When we talk about Russia and the West, there seems to be a quote-unquote war going on or something like that. When we talk about China-U.S. trade relations, there seems to be being portrayed as a possible trade war. Are we really going back with no hesitation to the Cold War era as we are speaking right now?
I think it's really same in a way that there is a confrontation, but it's different.
So is it only rhetorical? Or is it being used as a rhetoric way of defending one's own interests?
I think that what's absent there is the ideological element. It's not Chinese communism or Russian communism against American capitalism. And there is different layers that the war is much more globalized. But the problem here that the vision that Russia and China would integrate into the international system accepting U.S. leadership is a very flawed one as soon as the countries have gained more resources to stand up and say, we probably want to be sovereign and not let anybody impose your will upon us.
Right.
Russia did that in a very brutal and dramatic way, fighting for its sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space.
Two things I have to ask as a result of what you just said. One is whether the U.S. really demonstrating its leadership in the world today for the others to whether to follow or to accept. That's one thing. The other thing is whether you should combine China and Russia together, because these two countries seem to have some very different stages of development, so to speak. So I wonder, how would you respond to my question related to your colleague's answer?
Look at the United States and its allies, and that's where the leadership is, and that's where the leadership will stay. On issues
with
that
which ally, by the way?
Well, European allies.
There seems to be a big spar going on over there about whether to protect their allies in the future anymore.
Well, I don't think we should be that worried about the future of NATO. I think NATO will stay, and I think that when push comes to shove, the allies in the near future and medium-term future are likely to follow the U.S. lead on most important issues. So the United States leadership exists in that part of the world. The United States, however, has lost a position that it's occupied since the end of the Cold War, And that position was the unchallenged leader of the entire world, where China and Russia and so many others looked up to the United States for global leadership. Now this leadership has been challenged by China, primarily in economic terms, but not exclusively in economic terms, in some very direct terms by Russia, in places like Ukraine, places like Syria, and other places. So this situation leads us to a more contentious period in international relations.
What is this role of China-Russia relations in a way? How do you see the potential of that? And what would it mean to, let's just say, the countries like the United States and others who are trying to group these two together?
I think that there is a lot of natural compatibility between the interests in places like Central Asia and just economically, because Russia has a terrible problem with infrastructure. Whoever travels there knows that Russia needs to do a lot. China has tremendous experience. China has abundance of capital to invest. Russia wants to attract that capital. So that doesn't create a lot of contradictions. And I think that Chinese leadership is apprehensive of other sensitivities, particularly when you're talking to great power, a proud great power like Russia. And so far it has worked well in a very good fashion.
Really?
Well,
it's great to see the colleagues debate against one another.
The Russia-China relationship is one of the central pillars of stability across Eurasia, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned. Second, it's a new kind of a great power relationship that is not built on necessarily on an alliance against a third party.
Yes.
I don't think that this is the Sino-Russian rapprochement was about the United States. It was not historically. I'm talking about post-Soviet period.
Yes.
And it's not today. China and Russia are led by, in my view, the relationship is based on the formula: we will never be against each other, but we will not necessarily be with each other all the time, which is a fine combination of reassurance and flexibility. And that, I think, will serve both countries well into the going forward.
How is that likely to go with these two countries, China and Russia as well, given that President Putin has just got this very strong mandate, and Chinese President Xi Jinping as well, unanimous, that's a unanimous vote into the office as the president. So how do you see that is likely to go along the road?
Well, I think that the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is more of a platform than an organization, and I would say a useful platform. That is a platform that has recently expanded to include India and Pakistan, which has turned the SCO into a more complex and complicated organization. At this point, what's more important than multilateral initiatives are the initiatives taken by countries or agreed between countries. And I think that Russian-Chinese collaboration could be extremely useful in promoting stability in Eurasia, promoting prosperity in Eurasia, and in combination with other bilateral relationships, that could serve a very useful purpose of creating a zone of peace and collaboration in continental Asia. That will be extremely difficult to do for a number of reasons. Relations between several countries, including some of the major powers, are not very encouraging, let's put it that way. But that's an absolute must. This is a task that could be resolved eventually using the fine platform of the SCO, but don't oversell it.
I see. Before we go, I do want to ask an important question. Okay, the election has wrapped up. High numbers, we got it. But the question is, what's next? What is going to be the economic plan, if there is any? Do you have any advice? If you are being asked by the Kremlin, by the way. Secondly, what about the future generations of Russian leaders? Are we seeing some ladders already lining up for the future choices or selections?
I would say that on the economy side, Mr. Putin has employed his former finance minister, who he knows for many years, Alexei Kudrin, and there is a blueprint. The question is whether Russia will embark on bold economic structural reforms, which are risky, including some interest groups, or it can muddle through and continue the way it does with some marginal improvements. And I would think that the second scenario is more likely. As for generation, it's not lining up. Mr. Putin is himself very actively and skillfully managing this transition, trying to create a group of around 300, 400, several hundred people whom he rotates between the region and the central government, also using very much the Chinese model of grooming up generations of leaders. And he tries to create an artificial collective successor of whom he would later on pick several people who will be the core of this leader. But that's unprecedented in Russian history, that a monarch, a tsar, though he is called an elected president, is trying to manage this transition and not transition to one person, but to a group and generation of new leaders.
That's a big experiment he's doing right now, according to you.
Absolutely. And I think that will be the major essence of the 6 years. That's where all the effort will be dedicated, resting aside some black swans.
I see.
Well, I would not look for reform with a big capital R in the next several years, although there will be some reforms. Russia's economic problem is not economic as politico-economic. That calls for very significant changes that I think will be undertaken years from now. On the other issue, I think for Mr. Putin, the priority is preparing for the post-Putin leadership. And to him, governance is the most important thing in Russia. It's a make or fail situation. Russia failed twice in its history just because, and basically went down the drain, just because its leadership was too weak. Now, Putin does not want that to be repeated. So he's working very hard on the leadership issue. The issue is whether Putin's plan eventually, and Putin's appointees and nominees and candidates will get the mandate from the Russian people. That's the most important thing that Mr. Putin has learned, and I believe that the new generation will have to operate under those conditions.
A lot of food for thoughts, gentlemen. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your understanding about what is going on in Russia and its relations with some of the most important players in the world. Thank you so much, Dmitry Trenin and also Alexander Gavliev. It's great to have you here, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us.
Always a pleasure being with you.